Recording. And Jim, go ahead and share your screen and it's all yours.
Is that showing up?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for having me here tonight. And as Joni had said, my wife Deb and Deb unfortunately is not here tonight. She's having a bad back day, and so she's a little under the weather. But we're going to talk tonight about a trip that we took to Cuba. We took this trip in 2016. It's hard to believe it's been that long ago now. But before we talk about the trip, let me just explain a little bit about Deb and I and kind of what our journey has been as far as bird photography is concerned. Because now it certainly has become borderline obsession type of activity. But this all started back in 2010. And what happened is we went to a travel show down at the San Diego Civic Center. And typical travel show, just row after row of booths trying to get you to come to their place. And before the night was over, we signed up for a 10-day trip to Costa Rica. And we were very excited about it. We'd never been to Central or South America. And so indeed, a couple months later, we show up at the airport and we go on the tour, and we had an absolutely wonderful time. It was just terrific. We fell in love with Costa Rica, and it just went off very, very well. But when Deb and I got back from Costa Rica, we had a discussion, and there were two things that we decided. The first one is that we were very disappointed with the pictures of birds that we took, during that trip. Now, I will admit to you, we did not go to Costa Rica looking at the birds or taking pictures of the birds. But if you've ever been to Costa Rica, you cannot avoid the birds. They're everywhere. And so when we got back, the pictures were not good. And as a consequence, we decided that if we were going to continue, this activity, we needed to up our game, both in the way of equipment and expertise. And so that's been an ongoing activity for us over the last 13 years. But the second thing we decided is that even though this tour had been very nice and they had done everything they said they were going to do, we decided that when we visited different countries, we want a little bit more intimate experience. We want an intimate experience with the birds, but we also want that with the people and with the country. And so from that point on, we no longer signed up or participated in any international tour type of trips. We set our own trips up, and we set them with the idea of trying to interact as much as possible with the country and with the people. So keep that in mind when we go through these slides, of this trip. Now, the second thing is why Cuba? I think most Americans are somewhat intrigued with Cuba. It has been somewhat mysterious, kind of forbidden fruit type of thing. And certainly they do have nice birds there. There's no question about that. But I think more than any other country we have visited, the country and the people itself were the stars of the show. And so, again, keep this in mind. Okay, let's talk about going to Cuba through Mexico back in 2016. Now, oh, Joni.
Uh-oh, what's it doing?
It's not moving.
It's not moving.
No, it's not. Okay, hang on. Oh, there we
There we
go.
go. There we got it.
Joni and I have had problems getting this together on Zoom over this last couple of weeks. She's been a big help. First of all, traveling to Cuba as an individual back in 2016 had some obstacles. This was before Obama had opened up travel from the US to Cuba, and therefore it was not legal for US citizens to travel to Cuba except through organized tours, so-called cultural exchange tours. And these were done mostly through universities at the time. Now, these were not only expensive, but the itineraries were not of much interest to Deb and I. So we decided to go a different route, and we decided to travel through Mexico. Now, Mexico has flights every day to and from Cuba. There are flights from Mexico City, from Cancun, from other cities in Mexico. So this is a regularly scheduled event for them. The way it works for a US citizen traveling through Mexico is that when you went to the check-in counter at the airport, just like any other international airport, they look at your passport, they look to see that you're going to Cuba, and what they do is they issue a loose piece of paper that fits into your passport. When you arrive in Cuba, that is stamped with your entrance visa. When you leave Cuba, it is stamped with your exit visa. When you then renew your passport, you remove that paper. There is no record that you've ever been to Cuba. So that's the way it worked at that particular time. Now, it was also difficult getting information and finding context. And the internet was not quite as robust then as what it is now. But nonetheless, there were places that you could get information. Birding Pals, there are some other websites that were available. So we were able to get information and to make contact with people in Cuba. The last problem, and this was probably the biggest issue, and this is money and payments. First of all, at that particular time, Cuba had a very confusing money system. They had three separate currencies that they accepted. They accepted US dollars, but that was with the 10% penalty or tax. They had Cuban pesos and Cuban dollars. Now, very oversimplified, Cuban dollars are what the rich people use, Cuban pesos are what the poor people used. It was also not possible to transfer money to Cuba for deposits or payments. So everything was done via an email handshake. And I will admit to you that when we walked out of that airport, I had misgivings. Is there going to be anybody here to pick us up? Well, there were, and the whole thing went off without a hitch, not a problem. Now, some of those obstacles have been removed, but some of them are still in place if you wish to travel to Cuba today. This is the island of Cuba. And one of the things you'll notice is that Cuba is oriented more east and west than it is north and south. The other thing is that when Deb and I travel, we do not like to drive long distances when we are in a country. We don't like to take domestic flights in country if we can avoid it. So what we do is we tend to limit our visits to a very small portion of that country. And if it turns out we like it, which we almost always do, then we go back a second or third time and we go to different areas in that country. On this particular trip, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but we're going to stay in the northwest corner of Cuba. That's all that we're going to, that's all the only place we're going to visit. We're going to start off by landing in Havana, the capital. Now, it turns out that on this trip, we're going to be in Havana at two different times, at the beginning and at the end. And we decided to break our trip up into two parts. The first part, when we arrived, we were going to stay in so-called Old Havana. We're going to stay in one of the old grand hotels from the 40s, 50s, the heyday, of Havana. Now, when we come back the second time into Havana, we're going to stay in so-called New Havana, the tourist area. But let's start off in Old Town, Old Havana. We stayed at a place called the Hotel Plaza Habana. This is the dinnerware we ate on. And when you walked in on the ground floor of this hotel, it was absolutely grand. Beautiful tropical hardwoods, beautiful tiles, painting, architecture. It was truly stunning. And you could absolutely picture that if you went back 75 years, there would be Hollywood stars and mafiosa and who knows who else, in this hotel. It was a wonderful experience. This is the ground floor bar when you walked in, directly across from the reception. And again, note the architecture and the beautiful, windows. I mean, it was just really breathtaking. Now, this picture is being taken as Deb and I are walking in for happy hour. Now, happy hour here at this hotel is done a little bit differently than what you are used to. Yes, it's in the afternoon, the 4 to 6 or somewhere in that neighborhood. But what they do is, as long as you are drinking Cuban national drinks, that mainly means rum drinks, you purchase your first drink. And as long as you do not drain the drink totally, they will fill it back up for free. Now, if you drain the drink, then you have to buy a new one. But a little different, but I will tell you that over 3 days, Deb and I got used to this real quickly. We spent some serious time here in the bar. This is the dining area of the hotel. Again, note the architecture. Look at the chairs. It was just amazing. And this is where we had our dinners, here at Hotel Havana. Now, we've had fun. We've explored the bottom floor. Now it's time to go to our room. And our room was up on the 3rd floor. Well, the first thing that was apparent is the elevator didn't work. And I'm not sure I would have taken the elevator even if it did work. But we schlepped our bags up the stairs and went into our room. A very stark contrast to the downstairs. It was a big room, but the beds, there were 2 beds. They were literally Ricky and Lucy, single beds, 2x4s bolted together with a thin mattress. The bathroom had broken tiles. The shower was a pipe coming out of the wall. No shower head, just a pipe coming out of the wall. Now, I will say the room was clean. We had hot water the whole time we were there. We had electricity the whole time we were there. But this was our first introduction to the incredible contrasts that you see in Cuba between the old time, the good times, so to speak, and the bad times that have come subsequently. There was a rooftop bar. We went up there. Now, this is Deb looking out over the Havana skyline. And this picture demonstrates the same thing that I just talked about. You'll notice that building in the background with the tower and the eagle up on top and the beautiful, painting and architecture. That's a government building. Now, I don't know what they do there, but it's a government building. Now, contrast that with the buildings across the street. Those are warehouses and commercial areas. Mold, peeling paint, broken windows, wires everywhere. This contrast is present everywhere in Cuba. That's the view out our bedroom window. You're looking down one of the pedestrian streets. This is old Havana that we're looking at here. And most of these streets, there are no cars allowed on them. And so they're pedestrian and horse. Horses are used a lot in Cuba, not so much for transportation of people, but transportation of goods. So that's old Havana. This is the street out in front of our hotel. And when people ask me, find out that we've been to Cuba, one of the things we always get asked is, did you see the old cars? Well, you can't miss the old cars because the old cars are everywhere. These are not museum pieces. This is what people drive every day. What we're doing here is we're waiting for this car is a taxi, and he's going to take us into the city of Havana. That's across the street of the same boulevard. The reason I point this house out is not everybody in Cuba is poor. And so here again, contrast. This was the taxi that we took the second day we were there. This is a so-called Coco cab, and they are everywhere. This young lady picked us up at the hotel at 8 in the morning, and she kept us until 4 in the afternoon. $20 is what she charged, and she took us everywhere in Havana. Not only the tourist downtown areas, but we went into residential, we went into community parks, we went everywhere. And she was terrific, at explaining, where we were at, what the significance was. She was also extremely proud of her country, and she made no bones about it. She told you she was. This is John Lennon Park, one of the little community parks that we went to. John Lennon's big in Cuba. He went there a number of times during his later years. But the reason this picture is in here, you'll notice that John is wearing his iconic aviator sunglasses. Well, that's not part of the statue. Off the side, there is a little woman sitting in a chair. And what she would do is every time she saw a tourist coming, for 50 cents, she would come put these glasses on John Lennon. And so you could take your picture. That's Deb with her iconic glasses and John with his. This is an example of the entrepreneurship that we saw over and over again among the local citizenry, of Cuba. So we've had a good time in Havana, seen some interesting sights, but now it is time to truly start the meat and potatoes of the trip. We are picked up at our hotel by a man by the name of Orestes Martinez. And Orestes is probably the premier bird guide in Cuba, certainly in the northwest corner of Cuba. And he has set up the next 10 days for us. He has rented a car, a Toyota Sequoia, a huge SUV that we're going to travel in, and he has set up all the arrangements for us. So he picks us up, and we are going to Vinales, which is right here with the red X. Now, Vinales is a small city, and it's known for two things. First of all, it is the primary tobacco growing area of Cuba. And so much of the Cuban cigar tobacco comes from this area. But the second thing it's known for are these limestone karsts that are in the background. These are mesas that are elevated up above the surrounding flat agricultural land. These are similar. Now, they're not quite as grand, but they're similar to Arizona sky islands in that they separate different ecosystems among these karsts. As we're traveling, and the roads were good. They were 4-lane roads, at least the roads we were on, 4-lane roads, well maintained, not a problem, getting around. But when you looked off the side of the roads, this was a typical farmer. What he is doing is he has dug a channel from the small pond. He is irrigating a rice paddy that is down below here, all done by hand. You'll notice his oxen in the background that pull his cart. Horses and oxen are used a lot, in the agriculture down there. When we arrive at Vidialis, there are no hotels there, at least no hotels that we would stay in. What we're going to do is we're going to stay in a so-called Casa Particular. About 50 years ago, the Cuban federal government authorized its citizens to start renting rooms or casitas out and then keep the income themselves. And so this is now a thriving industry. And so this is where we are going to be staying for the next 3 days. This gentleman on the left is bringing our welcoming drinks to us. That's what it looks like inside. Very Spartan, but very comfortable, very clean, not a problem at all. The family was absolutely terrific. They prepared all of our meals. They socialized with us. It was terrific. That's looking out the back door of the Casa Particular. That's tobacco growing right ahead of us. That's a tobacco drying barn in the background. Now, in this particular area of Vidialis, maybe most of the homes, this was very typical. They had small acreages, and they grew on part of the acreage, they grew a cash crop. Tobacco, sugarcane, citrus was grown. Then on the remainder of the land, they grew vegetables for their own personal consumption. So this was a very typical picture that we saw there. This is where we ate our meals that were prepared for the family. They served us each night out here. The first day we were here, they asked us what did we want to eat for a protein source that night. And our choices were lobster, fish, or poultry. And we said, well, lobster, why not? And so the teenage kid goes and gets in his boat and goes out in the bay and spears lobster for us. And so we had fresh lobster that night here. Meals during the whole trip were very, very typical. Beans and rice are a staple, every meal. Vegetables are served, generally cooked vegetables, no salads at all, and then a protein source. For Deb and I, it was absolutely terrific. We loved the food, there. But that was very, very typical, picture as far as food is concerned. And those are the drinks of the evening. That is a Cuban mojito. And Deb and I fell in love with these drinks. But I will tell you that since we returned from Cuba, every other mojito we've had has been disappointing. One of the reasons why, the mint in that drink was in the garden 5 minutes ago. The sugar was harvested from their own sugar cane. The limes were squeezed from their own trees, and the rum they distilled themselves from their own sugar cane. It doesn't get fresher than that, and they were terrific. This is the street out in front of the Casa Particular, and I show this picture for a couple of reasons. This was February, and even though this is subtropical environment, it was cool. Long sleeve shirts, you never had to wear a jacket, but long sleeve shirts were the norm. It rained one day while we were there. You can see the puddles, but the rain fortunately did not interfere, with our activities at all. Other than that, it was high, overcast, and sunny. It was nice weather. Now, these gentlemen came by every afternoon at about 4 o'clock. What they're doing is they're selling firewood. All of these homes have wood burning stoves and cooktops. And so the women would come out and buy a bag of firewood, from them. They came by every afternoon. This is the corner bar. These people are up here having a drink. This is a Saturday afternoon. I like to think they're on their way home from work. You can see one of the people up there had to untie his horse from the hay cart that he was taking home. But these are people having a beer late in the afternoon at the little bar. You'll also notice the signs on the right-hand side. These are for the casa particulars that I mentioned. Very, very common in these small towns. Not so much in the big city and not in Havana, but in the small towns, these were very, very common. Our typical day with our bird guide, now this is February, so the days are short, but he would pick us up at about 6 in the morning. We would drive to where we're going. We would do our bird photography, and about 10 o'clock, he would bring us back, and we would get off at our casa particular, and he would leave us until about 3 in the afternoon, and he would pick us back up again, and we'd go to a different spot. The point is that Deb and I have a lot of free time on our hands. So in this particular deal, we are waiting. This taxi is going to take us and just show us around the city of Vinales. This is the taxi that we took. That's the taxi that the locals took. That woman is waiting for her groceries to be brought out to the cart. And the man that brings them out will then take her on home. So that's the local taxi. We did see birds. This is a Cuban peewee. This is a regionally endemic bird, not only around Vinales, but we saw it in a number of places up in this northwest quadrant. A very aggressive bird. This bird would show up at the first sign that there was anything going on. This is always number one on most people's list of birds that they want to see. This is a Cuban Tody. Now, this bird is tiny. This is house wren, maybe even smaller than house wren size, and it's a flycatcher. This bird hawks insects out of the air. But what's interesting about this bird, in spite of its tiny size, this is an aggressive bird and constantly battling with other birds in its area. It's a really aggressive bird. Looks like it was put together by kindergartners. I mean, it is just unbelievable. That's the front side. That's the back side, of this bird. Certainly a highlight, of our visit. This is another Cuban endemic bird. This is a Cuban solitaire. And typical of solitaires, it's pretty drab, gray and brown, but also typical of solitaires, it has a beautiful song. This is the morning bird of Cuba. This is the bird that sings before the sun comes up. Pretty widespread, and again, just a gorgeous song. We did see some old friends there too. This is a white-winged dove. This was the only time we saw white-winged doves in Cuba. We did see other types of doves that we'll see here in just a few minutes, but this was the only white-wing we saw. This is an endemic bird. This is a Cuban bullfinch. Typical of most seed-eating birds, this bird spends a lot of time on the ground, low bushes. In fact, this picture is taken out of a car window. This bird is in the ditch alongside the road, but that's a Cuban bullfinch. This is a poor picture Another endemic. At this time, this was called a Cuban nightjar. It's now called a greater Antillean nightjar. This is an endemic bird, Cuban vireo, another pretty aggressive, bird. We saw these birds pretty frequently too. They were pretty widespread. This is a tree swallow. Now, the reason I put this picture in here is not because this was such an unusual bird in Cuba, but this is February, and this bird has a nest. Just off to the left here, there is a tree with a hollow in it, and this bird has a nest up there. So I don't know, maybe they nest early there. Catbird, we went to several places where there were fruiting bushes with berries and fruits on them, and the catbirds would frequently be there. This bird is beautiful in its own right, in my opinion. This is a yellow-faced grass quit, a widespread bird. This bird is throughout Latin and even into South America. But this picture always makes me very wistful because it reminds me of the one bird that I totally whiffed on in Cuba, and that is a Cuban grass quit, a beautiful yellow-faced, grass quit bird, pretty bird. And we saw it, but I totally screwed up the camera settings and got no pictures of the bird. So that's one, if we went back, that would be high on my list. So this is just a sampling of the birds that we saw and photographed in Vinales. But now we're going to move on. We've been 3 days in Vinales. Now we are going to move to a small town called Playa Larga. Now, Playa Larga is a very small town. It's probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. And it sits right at the head of a long, narrow bay right there. Now, this bay is infamous. This is the Bay of Pigs. This is the site of the ill-fated CIA-sponsored invasion of Cuba back in the 60s. So that's the Bay of Pigs. The reason we are at Playa Larga, though, is because of this, Parque Nacional Sinaga de Zapata. This is the largest national park in Cuba. It is also the largest wetland in Cuba. And so that's why we are going to be spending significant time in this area. This is what the head of the Bay of Pigs looks like. I saw no plaques or monuments there, but there were a lot of abandoned military materials, these trenches and ammunition dumps and whatnot there. That's what that's what Playa Larga looks like from the bay side. Those boats are privately owned commercial fishing boats, and you can see the town is primarily on the water. Now, we pulled in to Playa Larga late morning. So Orestes, our guide, got us set up in the Casa Particular, and then he said he would be back at 3. So we decided that we wanted to see the town. So we hailed for a taxi, and this is the taxi in town. This is a pedal-powered taxi, and $1 this gentleman charged us and took us up and down the town, which wasn't much, but took us up to the beaches and down around the bay. He was with us, probably an hour or so, showing us around. This is the main drag in Playa Larga, and this is the front porch, the deck of the Casa Particular that we're staying in. Now, in this particular Casa Particular, we had a private bedroom and a private bathroom within the house. The hostess, the woman of the house, did not want us taking pictures inside the house. And so we did not. So this is the only picture that we have of this particular Casa Particular. We ate our dinners out here. They would set up a table for us, and this is where we ate our breakfasts and our dinners out in front. Now, the gentleman standing there on the street, that is the trash man. Every day, every morning, he came by and gathered up the trash from the cities. The ladies would bring it out in their bags or in their cans and dump it into his little cart. Again, another day, we had some time and we wanted to go to a town that was about 2 miles around the bay, another small town. And so we asked our hostess what would be the best way to get there. And she said, we'll take the bus. And so she directed us how to get there. And we walked down, and this is the bus. For 25 cents each, this took us to the next town. Every 2 hours, this horse and wagon makes a trip back and forth between the two towns. This is not tourist material. This is the way that people move around. I don't know if you can appreciate this. This is Playa Larga. This is the bay. This is the large wetland over here to the left. To the right is primarily agricultural land. That is on the right-hand side is where the parrots and the parakeets were at. So that's why we're going to be there. Now, this is typical wetland, marsh, reeds, whatnot, but there are extensive irrigation canals cut through this. And these canals have dikes along the sides of them. Some of them are just merely walking paths. Others are big enough you can drive on. So we spent a lot of time on these dikes and in these areas. This is a Western emerald. Now, this hummingbird in this picture was taken in the backyard of a woman that lived there in Playa Larga. And for 25 cents, she would let you come into her backyard and take pictures of the hummingbirds. She had 2 hummingbird feeders, and I will tell you, these hummingbird feeders were literally held together with duct tape. They were ancient, but the hummingbirds came to them. And so indeed, we got to see hummingbirds. She also had a number of these trees. I don't know what the name of it is, but they have long tubular orange flowers. And the hummingbirds like those too. But this is a Western emerald. It is a regional endemic. It's found on some other Caribbean islands. But this one is not. This is a Cuban endemic. This is a bee hummingbird, the smallest bird in the world. And this bird is tiny. This bird is half the size of our Allen's hummingbirds, to give you an idea. It is a tiny, tiny bird. This is a female that we're looking at right here. This is another of the doves that I mentioned. This is a blue-headed quail dove. Now, this is a bird that is uncommon, but it is a bird that is just the ultimate skulker. It can fly, but it doesn't like to. It spends all of its time in the undergrowth, within the forest. It's a bird that most people as tourists would never see if they went to Cuba. But what we're doing is we're sitting at a little outdoor restaurant. And every afternoon, the owner of this restaurant throws rice out onto the ground, cooked rice. And these birds come in the afternoon. And he charges $1, and he lets you come in and you can take pictures, of these birds. We saw Zenaida doves. We saw ovenbirds, here too. So there were other birds that came, to this area. This is a Cuban endemic bird. This is a loggerhead shrike. We watched this bird catch this butterfly and beat this butterfly for about 5 minutes. I mean, it took a long time for it to finally subdue this butterfly, but he finally did, and he ate it. So that's a loggerhead shrike. This is a Cuban parrot. Again, a regional endemic. They are on some other islands, in the area. What our guide would do is every morning when he picked us up at 6 o'clock, he would get on the phone and he would contact different farmers in the area. And what he would ask is, are the birds there today? And pretty soon he'd find where the flock of parrots is at, and that's where we'd drive to, and that's where we'd go. This bird was with a flock, maybe 10 or 12, present there. And they were present at this farm. This is a Cuban parakeet. Now, this is a Cuban endemic bird. The same thing. Orestes would call around until he found out where they were at. They travel in a little larger flock. They're in maybe 25, 30 birds, were in this flock. And they're very, very typical parakeets. They have a lot to say to each other every morning. And so when you get out of the car at the farm, you would have no doubt you were at the right farm because you could hear them long before you could see them. One of the more interesting birds, this is also an endemic bird. This is a great lizard cuckoo. Great eye, that red eye. This bird is very slender, but very long. This bird is probably 35% longer from beak to tail than our squirrel cuckoos are. Long, skinny bird. This is a Cuban oriole. This is a juvenile. That's the adult oriole. There was a place that we went that had some fruiting bushes, and we would stop there every morning. There was always activity there. The orioles were regulars. West Indian woodpecker. All the woodpeckers that we're going to look at here are medium-sized woodpeckers, roughly flicker, size woodpeckers. This is an endemic bird, as is this. This is a Cuban green woodpecker. This is a Fernandina's woodpecker. This is their flicker, related to the flickers. Cuban blackbird. Another shot. These are the berries that were present on the bush that we would stop at every day. This is a Cuban pygmy owl, an endemic owl. And this bird perched right alongside the road. We went by this bird every day. And every day we'd stop to see if he was on a better perch for photography, but he never was. He was always in the same place. In fact, you can see the branch where it's all worn off right there. That's where this bird lives, is right there on that branch. At the time I saw this bird, this was a Cuban screech owl. It is now a bare-legged owl, and it also is a Cuban endemic. There was a pair of them that lived in this hollowed out palm tree. This was right along the trail to one of the dikes. And every time we'd walk by it, our guide would just take his fist and he'd knock on the tree one time. And these birds would pop up, look to see what was going on, and then they'd drop right back down into the tree. This is a red-legged thrush. It's related to our robins and other thrushes. A beautiful bird. It is also regionally endemic. And this is the third bird that everybody wants to see when they go to Cuba. This is a Cuban Trogon. This is the national bird of Cuba. And it behaves very, very typical of Trogons. By that I mean early in the morning, it goes to a bush or tree and gorges itself on berries and fruits. You can see this bird's crop is just stuffed. After they've stuffed themselves, they will fly to a perch and they will regurgitate the seeds, or the fruits, the berries, I should say, redigest the berries and spit the seeds out. So our guide knew where there were piles of these seeds in the forest. And we would just go stand and wait, and sooner or later, the Trogon would come. So this is one that we saw. This is a second bird, different bird. And again, you can see the crop is just filled with seeds. Look at that tail, just that scallop tail, just a wonderful bird. This is a Stygian owl, again, a regionally endemic owl. And this is the rarest bird that we saw on the trip. I mentioned that there were dikes that you could walk along. We would walk along these dikes early in the morning. You can see how yellow the light is. The sun has just come up here. This is a Zapata sparrow. And these birds would be on the ground feeding as we walked along, and they would fly up into the low bushes along the edges. This bird is only found in an area about 20 square miles. So very, very limited range. As is this bird. This is a Zapata wren. It also is found in a very, very limited area and is considered an endangered species. Now, I mentioned that these were wetlands and had dikes and shallow irrigation canals. As a consequence, they were perfect habitat for wading birds. Now, these are all birds that you're completely familiar with, but they just were beautiful birds in this particular setting. A great egret, it's a great blue heron, little blue heron, snowy, yellow crown. We did see an osprey, which are not common, in Cuba, but we did see one. Green heron, this habitat with lots of vegetation growing down the sides of the dikes and out into the water was just perfect habitat for green herons. So we saw a lot of these guys. So we've had a good time in Playa Larga, and now we're headed back to Havana. This is roughly the route that we took, a triangle. And remember, this time in Havana, we are going to stay in New Havana. Now, in the United States, we, I think, as a people, tend to think of Cuba as very, very isolated. And certainly from the U.S. citizens, it has been for a long time. What we forget is that 99% of the world travels to Cuba. There is a thriving tourist, industry in Cuba. That's the hotel that we stayed at. You could have picked this hotel up and put it on Miami Beach, and it would have fit right in. The Hotel Memories Miramar of Havana. Big drive-up entryway, just a very typical beach tourist hotel. That's what the rooms looked like. That was the view out our window. Again, just typical tourist hotel. Now, we were there for 3 days, and I will admit, we did not do much, during that time period. There was a beach out in front, about 100 yards out front, and we walked the beach and looked around the area. But by and large, we just got ready for our trip home. What we did, because this trip to Cuba was actually part of a much longer trip. We spent a week in Mexico City, then flew to Havana, then flew back to Cancun, and we spent 10 days in the Yucatan. We watched some of the Maya, went to some of the Maya archaeological sites, but the main thing is we chased flamingos around in Yucatan. In the wintertime, there's lots of flamingos there, so that was our primary activity. Then we flew on home to San Diego. Now, what was the tally for birds? Well, before we actually look at numbers, I want to make something clear. Deb and I are interested in photography only. In fact, not just Cuba, but wherever we go, we tell the guide, don't even bring your scope because we are not interested in looking at birds through the scope. You bring your binoculars. We are much more interested in looking at birds that are 30 meters away, not 100 meters away. We personally don't even bring binoculars. Now, the reason I say that, we saw 67 out of 368 reported species in Cuba. If you went specifically looking at birds, your count would be much, much higher than that. But that's what we saw. That's what we photographed, while we were there. We were happy. We saw all 16 of the endemic birds that are in Northwest Cuba. There are 27 total in Cuba, but many of those they're not found in the area we were. And we saw an additional 7 regionally endemic birds. We were very happy, with the bird tally and the bird photographs that we got. Now, what did this trip cost? It was 15 days, counting travel, 1 day in, 1 day out. Airfare to and from Mexico was $670. Lodging in Havana, including breakfast, was 7 days, was $640. Meals and taxis in Havana were just a little under $300. When my wife goes to a new hotel, a new area, the first thing she does is she goes to the hotel receptionist and she says, if you were going on a date tonight and going out to dinner, where would you go? And that's the restaurant that we frequent. And we have been to some absolutely wonderful places around Latin America. What's a bonus is they're cheap. And so as a consequence, meals didn't cost us very much. Our guide, our driver, 8 days lodging in Casa Particulars, which included all meals, was $1,175. Total cost, just a little under $3,000 for the trip. Now, there are some changes that have taken place since we took that trip. The first thing, I'm going to make a disclaimer. I am not an expert on traveling to Cuba. And so if you want to travel to Cuba, you need to do your due diligence. But there are some things that have changed. The first one is it is now legal for individual U.S. citizens to travel to Cuba. Now, you still have to fill out this little form stating that you are going for cultural exchange. It's a sham, and everybody knows it is, but that's what you have to do. There are many direct flights from the U.S. now. Miami, Atlanta, Dallas, there's flights, to Havana from the U.S. U.S. dollars are no longer accepted in Cuba. Now, the Cuban currency has devalued as their economy has continued to tank. So your dollar does go a lot further, but you can't exchange U.S. dollars in Cuba. You have to exchange into Canadian dollars or euros before you go to Cuba. You also want to keep in mind your U.S. issued credit and ATM cards do not work in Cuba, nor can you wire money into Cuba. So as a consequence, the money that you walk off that plane with is the money you will have. And I will admit to you, I cut it a little short. When we got on that airplane, I had less than $75, in my pocket. So you want to keep this in mind as far as if you do decide to travel. All in all, it was a wonderful trip. And we are planning on going back to Cuba. What has happened in the meantime is that we have started going to a wide variety of different countries, mostly Latin America, but also Europe. And so Cuba has kind of slid down the list, but it's still there. We will go back. Any information that you want to get, it's much, much more easily available today. Birding Pals has lots of info. Bird Forum, that is a large, very highly subscribed website out of the UK, and they do a lot of travel discussion on Bird Forum. eBird, of course, is now available, and even the tour companies, Red Hill or Neotropic or any of these tour companies that go to Cuba. I found that they're very open, about telling you where they go and what they like to do when they're there. If anybody has any questions or, interested in anything else, please feel free to speak up. Let me know. It was a great trip for us.
Yeah, Jim, if you want to stop sharing your screen and we'll bring everybody back. There we go. We had a question in the chat. Did you need to know how to speak Spanish, or were you able to get along in English?
First of all, the question being, do I speak Spanish? Yes, I speak Spanish. I can get by in the restaurant. I can get by at the mechanics, the car mechanics. Beyond that, no, I don't speak Spanish. No, we did not have a problem. Our guide, Orestes, spoke fluent Spanish. Our hostesses spoke very broken English. They want to learn to speak English. And so as a consequence, they take any opportunity to try to talk to you, in English. But can an English speaking person go, to Cuba? Absolutely. Google Translate now works great to get you by, too. I will say that in the airports, there were no English signage. It's all Spanish. But there were people the attendants and whatnot that spoke English, answer all your questions, not a problem.
Okay, great. And Michael and Jody, you got a question?
I do. Since the relationship between Cuba and the U.S. is kind of strained, is it difficult to have free movement? Or it sounded like you didn't have a problem, but on the other hand, I've heard when you go to some of the countries like these, it's really difficult to have free movements, and you almost have to always be with one of their countrymen or officials. That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. For us, that was not a problem at all. I am very, very accustomed to driving and moving in Latin American countries. Mexico, Ecuador, Panama. These countries have far more restrictions on your movement than Cuba did. There are military checkpoints everywhere in Cuba, or excuse me, in Ecuador, in Peru. Every 50 miles, there's a military checkpoint. Now, they don't stop you. They stop, they search your car. They don't keep you from going on. But the point is, in Cuba, there was none of that. I saw not one checkpoint. And Deb and I spent our afternoons wandering, by ourselves. Now, I will admit, we were typically in a taxi, of some sort. We weren't just walking the streets. Cuba has a very low incidence of violent crime. You have to remember, this is an authoritarian regime, and they deal with those types of things very swiftly and very harshly. Now, pickpocketing, yep, problem. All Latin America, all Europe, that's a problem. So you've got to keep that in mind. But as far as our safety is concerned and moving around, that was never an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
I have another one. Where did you find your guide? What'd you call him?
Um, the guide, I was fortunate in the respect that I had a friend who had previously used him. But Orestes is very active in birding pals. And he's on Facebook and Instagram, and so he's not difficult to get a hold of, at all. His moniker is El Chino del Zapata, the Chinaman of Zapata. Now, he's not Chinese at all. He is Cuban through and through. But when he was a young child, he got into a bumblebee nest, and his face swelled up so much from the stings that the kids started calling him El Chino, the Chinaman. And so that's what he goes now by, is El Chino. Anybody that's interested, I can get you some links, that would be interested in talking with him.
That would be great.
Yeah, if you want to send me those, Jim, I can include them in the notes
Okay.
when we
I'll do
start
that.
the
No
recording
problem at
out.
all.
Yeah, that would be great.
I will also include the links to the tour company that we used within Cuba to actually set the Havana hotels up, too. Phone service, we found, was a little bit scratchy at times. And so trying to contact some of these hotels directly was a challenge. But we have a young woman who runs a tour company in Cuba, and she set up the hotels for us without a problem.
Did you have a cell phone there?
No, we did not.
Okay.
And I never saw one used there. I mean, I don't know if they had them or not, but I never saw one used.
Okay. And do you know how the island is fared with all the various hurricanes coming through?
Not directly, I don't. I do talk, with Orestes, and they haven't had a problem. However, where they're situated, they don't catch generally the main brunt, of the hurricanes, and so they normally don't get, a lot of damage from them. But no, I don't know how they've done.
Okay.
I'm sure poorly.
Yeah. And another question is, did you tip the hotel staff and guides?
I'm sorry?
Did you tip the hotel staff and guides?
No, we did not.
Okay.
We did not. The hotels, per se, we just paid for, with cash, and we did not pay, we did not tip, because I wasn't real sure of myself, as far as how acceptable that was. So as a consequence, we did not, tip.
Any other questions? It looks like we're about wrapping up.
Very good.
So thank you for coming, and we'll be sending the recording out shortly for those that were not able to make it live. And thanks again, Jim, for everything.
Certainly. And I'll go ahead and try to dig up those links for you and get that sent out.
Okay, that'd be great. All right,
Okay.
thank you. Thanks
Thank you,
everybody for
guys.
joining us tonight. We'll see you next
Certainly.
month. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.